This is a guide to Visual Validator. Visual Validator is a simple GUI front-end to TKW Validator functionality. It allows drag and drop functionality in a Windows environment for the validation of spine or ITK messages. It instructs TKW to validate and report on message logs which are placed into its window. In this screencast, I'll be concentrating on the validation of spine messages, but this screencast is equally applicable for ITK message validation. Visual Validator is designed to be a replacement for OMVT2. Its required functionality is to automatically validate outbound messaging against specification documents, i.e. schemas, domain MIM, spine MIM, EIS and domain-specific requirements. It must also produce HTML reports with a pass-fail and references to any issues. It can validate different formats of message, so HL7 payload only, SOAP envelope and HL7 payload, or the full HTTP header with SOAP envelope, HL7 payload, and perhaps MIME parts for EBXML messaging. Visual Validator requires TKW to validate the messages and produce the reports. There is also a screencast for the installation of TKW. Visual Validator will accept multiple messages and will validate them using TKW Validation Engine. It will validate spine or ITK messages and display the results as a TKW style validation report. It uses the same rule set tests as OMVT2. These have been programmatically transformed into a TKW format. It produces identical results as to those produced by OMVT2. To install Visual Validator, first we must navigate to its position in the TKW installation, go to the Contrib, Additional Tools, Visual Validator, and double click on Setup. During the installation, it may require the additional installation of Microsoft.NET Framework 4. Here it's opened up automatically, but it can be also opened up from the Start button under HSCIC Visual Validator. The Visual Validator screen has three main parts. The first part is choosing the TKW configuration. If we go to our installation of TKW, and for example open up spine generic validation, we have two .properties files that we can choose from: TKW spine 1 and TKW spine 2. Spine 1 is for existing spine, spine 2 is for spine 2. The clear down validation folder before validation checkbox is used to remove or include message files which currently exist in the messages for validation folder. If it's checked, all existing messages in the folder will be deleted. The validation type can be chosen using the radio button for ITK validation or spine validation. Here we're using spine validation. The second area in Visual Validator is for file information, and this is where message logs are dragged and dropped. Here I'm going to be using some test messages from within the Contrib directory. If I open up the PDS, highlight the 4 messages there, we can drag and drop them into the second area. Here the validation report has been created, showing a summary at the top, 4 files validated, 72 checks, 72 passes and no issues. If we scroll down, we can see the HTML report has passes for each of the tests, for each of the messages. It's also necessary for spine messages to validate not only against the generic validation rule set, but here for PDS rule set. So here we can select in the TKW directory the spine PDS validation, select the TKW properties rule set. Here there's only one. Clearing down the validation folder before subsequent validations, spine validating, and we can drag and drop the same 4 messages again into Visual Validator. The TKW standard window appears and disappears, and the validation summary is displayed. 4 files validated, 24 checks applied, 24 passes. And again, in the HTML validation report, you can see each of the checks on each of the messages. In order to gather together the evidence from these validations, we can go into the TKW directory. Under config, we'll see the spine generic validation, validator reports, and there's the HTML of the validation report from the generic validation. If we open it up, here we can see again 4 files, 72 checks. Similarly, for the PDS evidence, we go back to the TKW directory. Under config, we'll see spine PDS validation. In the validator reports directory, we have a validation report, as before, and here it is, 4 files, 24 checks, no issues. Information on using TKW Visual Validator can be found within the config directory under Visual Validator, Visual Validator Guide.